Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Reasonable Doubt, brought to you by the Harris County Criminal Lawyers Association. I'm your host, Jimmy Ardwan, along with my co-host, Julio Vela. Julio, good evening.
Wonderful, Jimmy.
You enjoying your spring break?
Oh, spring break what? I'm an adult. My kid isn't in spring break yet. It's like, for all I know, it's the middle of March.
Right.
You know, it's a good day today. How are you doing?
It is a good day, man. I'm having a great time. We got a great show for you, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, live here in the studio, we got with us Jordan Lewis. Jordan, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm great. And joining us by Skype this evening, Chris Tritico, the one and the only, from Fox 26 Roundup. Chris, thank you for joining us. We having a few technical problems? We might be.
I'm here.
There you are. We finally got it up and running. Appreciate you joining us this evening. This is our first foray into the 21st century of using Skype technology here on the show. So we're trying to make it work.
Well, I don't Skype very well either, so.
Well, we're going to have a good time tonight. We got Chris by Skype. We got Jordan right here in the studio. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take your phone calls starting around 8:30. 713-807-1794 is the number. We also have Twitter up here in the studio. You can hit us up at HCCLA_TV. Send us your question and comments right there. But I want to dive into it right now, especially because we got Chris here, the political expert from Fox 26. Merrick Garland gets the nomination for the Supreme Court from President Obama. And Chris, I want to go to you first because you have some personal experience with him. I know you were one of the lawyers representing Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, who was convicted and eventually was put to death by the United States. But you had firsthand experience dealing with him because he was the lead prosecutor on that case. Tell me your impressions of him, your personal impressions of him.
Well, you know, I actually don't know Merrick. He was the lead over the investigation in the case. In the government, as is apt to do when they have unlimited resources, as they did in the Oklahoma City bombing, compartmentalizes things. And they had their trial team, the litigation team that I dealt with every day. That was about 6 lawyers. The investigation side, which Merrick headed up, I never interacted with. And so I've really never met Merrick. If I did meet him, it was only on a fleeting time. I don't know him at all. What I know about him is what you've been reading and what we've been seeing, and he certainly appears to be extremely qualified in my view. If you look at the president's appointment, this is the second time that he's looked at him for a Supreme Court nomination. You take the politics of today, you take Barack Obama and the hatred that the Republicans have for Barack Obama out of the mix, and I don't think Merrick ever gets this nomination.
Do you think, Chris, that his background as a DOJ prosecutor might help him in any way break this stranglehold that the Republicans seem to have on the hearing process?
Well, let me just start that off by saying that I think that what is happening with judicial appointments in the United States Senate, both by the Democrats and the Republicans, whoever's in charge, is really not in what the Constitution stands for. It's not what it was meant to be, and the politicization of our appointment process is the wrong road, regardless of who's in office. And so I don't agree with it. I never have. I have railed against it, regardless of who's in office, and I'm railing against it today. And what the Republicans are doing is wrong. It was wrong when the Democrats did it to Ronald Reagan, and it's been wrong every time. And so I'm adamantly opposed to what they're doing. What President Obama did, I think, in appointing Merrick is brilliant because he has been appointed before. He's been heralded by Republicans as a good jurist. He's been said by Orrin Hatch as someone who needs to be on the court. And so they're going to have a hard time saying we're not going to vote. We're not even going to give him a hearing. And so it's really hard for them to ignore Merrick as someone they're even going to give a hearing to. That's why President Obama picked him. He is a judge who is learned. He's a judge who's written a lot of opinions, and so he's a guy who knows what he's doing. It was a good pick by the president for this time and for this part of the political process. So I think the president did what he had to do to put the Republicans against the wall. All the polls say that the public is opposed to what the Republicans are doing. The general public says the Republicans in the Senate need to do their job. They need to have a vote up or down. If the Republicans don't want to put Merrick on the court, vote him down, but do the job you were elected to do. This is going to come back to haunt the Republicans.
Yeah, Jordan, I know you have some real strong opinions. We were talking before we went on the show, and you know, some of it's not fit for TV. But if you want to clean it up a little bit and give us your take on it.
Well, I mean, it's the Supreme Court. I mean, obviously, it's a very political institution. They're lifetime appointments because the idea was supposed to be that they were insulated from politics. But I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. It's also interesting. This is, and I may be a little bit off on this, but according to some stuff I was looking into, it's been almost 25 years since a white Protestant was nominated to the court. I don't think our founders necessarily would have foreseen the current makeup of the court, and I don't think they would have been all that comfortable with it.
What is the current makeup of the court?
Well, prior to Scalia passing away, there were 5 Catholics and 4 Jews, which it's simply not representative of what this country looks like. But the interesting thing about Merrick is he's an excellent judge who's being served up as a sacrificial lamb. I mean, there's no question about it. Chris, you're exactly right. Obama picked this guy because it's the perfect way to highlight how petty the Republicans are being, because this guy was not objectionable to them under any other circumstances other than we've got an election coming in November. What'll be interesting to see is if they do hold out this long, how does this play out, you know, the day after elections? And I think this was, I think we heard this earlier tonight. I wouldn't be at all surprised if Hillary wins the election in November, if the Senate punches through Merrick, because he's certainly better from the Republican standpoint. He's certainly better than anyone that Hillary is likely to nominate.
This comes back to haunt the Republicans in so many ways.
Yep.
Because if you break the election down, there's so many more paths for Hillary Clinton to be in the White House come January 2017 than any of the Republicans.
Right.
And the way the Republican Party is imploding, it might split into 2. No matter what happens here, we could have more than likely a Democrat in the White House, Hillary Clinton, and a democratically controlled Senate in 2017. And when that happens, the Republicans, wow, let me try that again. The Republicans, I do this for a living, the Republicans are going to wish that they'd have put Merrick on the Supreme Court, because once the Democrats take control of the Senate again, they're never going to get a centrist like Merrick again.
Well, and even if the Republicans hold the Senate, they're going to burn so much political capital here that they're just about going to have to confirm the first or second or maybe even the third nominee that Hillary puts up, and she can push increasingly to the left, and they're going to be left in a position of having to explain why they've decided to leave a vacancy on the Supreme Court for an unprecedented period of time.
And now lost in all of this, guys, is the fact that you come up into the busy season of the Supreme Court oral argument. When major cases are being decided. We've already seen that the Texas abortion case went up and was heard by the panel. We've got several other big arguments coming up this summer, and we could be at a deadlock on a bunch of these cases and really not getting any meaningful opinions out, and basically left with a Supreme Court that's not able to do its job.
Ineffectiveness, and you have appellate court cases that stand as the rulings at that point. And that's a shame. It's a shame that the politics, and what it is really the "we hate Obama" politics is taking control of the United States Senate, and that's what's happening.
Chris, how do you think this trickles down to the local level here in Harris County? Because I mean, we've got some big elections coming up here locally. The biggest, of course, being the district attorney's race, where you've got Kim Ogg as the Democratic nominee going against Devin Anderson. How do you think that shapes up in the local races here in Harris County?
It depends on what happens in the Republican, at the end of the day, in the Republican convention. If Donald Trump wins the nomination and there's a split among the Republicans, as I expect there will be at that point, and they split into 2 parties, then I expect that you're going to see a big push at the polls in Harris County. I don't know what's going to happen with Hillary Clinton at this point. You've got this Bernie or bust movement going on, and it's such a shame for the Democrats to be splitting the way they are right now when they were poised to take over the whole country. Now you've got this Bernie or bust movement that's poised to say, if Bernie Sanders doesn't get the nomination, which he is not going to get the nomination, go vote in the Green Party. So the Democrats were poised to take over the country. And while that's happening, now the Democrats are going to split into two when the Republicans are splitting into two. This is the oddest presidential year I've ever seen. The Democrats have not been pulling people to the polls the way the Republicans have. So in a year when we would expect Harris County to vote very strong Democrat, I don't know yet that we're going to see that. So Harris County really could still, even though the Democrats I think are going to win the race, Harris County could still go Republican this year.
Do you think, Chris, that Devin is going to face any problems with this whole Planned Parenthood investigation and the cases that are charged out of that? Because there has been some talk that there are people within the Republican Party. I've seen some blogs out there from some people in the political world who may or may not be influential in the Republican Party, suggesting to other Republicans just to not even vote for her. Leave her blank, but go vote straight ticket elsewhere, but just leave her blank because they're so angry about what happened with the Planned Parenthood investigation and the charging of the two individuals who went undercover, if you will, for the video.
Yeah, they can try that, but the problem is then you've got to tell people, you got to get people to go all the way down the ballot and do that. And the Republican Party wants to win more than they want to just drive Devin Anderson out because of one indictment. And I don't think that's going to happen. They're going to be saying vote straight ticket, just like the Democrats are saying vote straight ticket, because once you try to get people to go down and vote down ballot on those races, you start losing ballots, and they don't want to do that. They want people to go in and push one thing and go home. They want to make it as easy as possible. That's why I don't like straight ticket balloting. We get a lot of good judges washed out in straight ticket balloting. I don't like it. I never have. But the parties want it that way, and I don't think that Devin Anderson is going to win or lose because of that indictment. And quite frankly, she shouldn't win or lose because of that indictment. She did the job she was elected to do, and she went in. The grand jury did its job. I don't think Devin ever even entered the room. She did the job was done. The grand jury entered an indictment, and Devin shouldn't pay a price because a grand jury issued an indictment. It's not fair.
It seems to me that obviously the presidential year is the big needle mover with regard to local politics, and a situation like this where you have such a contentious Supreme Court nomination can really alter the needle at a local level a lot more than we really think. But we talked last week, Julio, about the judges and how people really they don't know who the judges are. I mean, the reality is most of them go out and vote straight ticket, and the judges just get caught up in that wave. And it's if the Democrats take the White House or if the Republicans take the White House or the Senate or wherever, that they kind of get caught up in that wave.
Well, and I pose this to each of you as well as Chris. How do you suppose that we live in one of the most diverse cities in the country? You can walk down the street downtown or anywhere in the Houston metropolitan area, and you can hear Chinese, Spanish, Hindu, all kinds of languages throughout the world. We live in one of the most diverse populous areas. Generally, everything outside of the judiciary tends to be somewhat a little bit democratic. How do we explain that it's the prosecution arm and the judiciary that are consuming the Republican seats?
Well, there are a couple of things going on. Number one, more than half of the courts are up for, all of the county courts are up for election in non-presidential years. I think comparing 2008, 2010, and 2012 is quite instructive. 2008, Obama's first run for president, we saw a Democratic sweep across the county. There were 2 countywide positions where Republicans held their seats. Ed Emmett, who was the county judge and had literally just 2 months prior walked Houston through Hurricane Ike, and I think everybody agrees did a pretty good job given everything that happened.
Chris is a huge fan of Ed Emmett, by the way.
Right.
We will rebuild.
And Pat Likas, who was running against C.O. Bradford, who was as close to damaged goods in Harris County politics as you can get. Those were the only 2 Republicans elected in that election cycle. 2010, when Obama was not at the top of the ticket, the Republicans swept again and took back any seats they had lost and maintained any seats that they had held. And then in 2012, we saw a little bit more of a mix when Obama was running again. We saw a handful of Republicans regain their seats. There were a few Democratic and judges, or what I have in mind, because that's what touches my life. But there were a few Democratic judges who kept their seats. But for the most part, all of the Democrats who'd been elected in '08 were washed out in 2012. And I think what it really shows is that demographically, Harris County is a Democratic county. How the offices go depends completely on turnout.
Well, you forgot the sheriff. You forgot the sheriff and the county attorney were both Democrat at that time, and they both retained their seats too.
Right.
But you're right. I mean, your analysis is correct. But what we see in Harris County that we've seen for the last 4 or 5 election cycles is that it swings Democrat or Republican just 1.5%, 2.5% is the biggest swing we've seen in any election cycle in the last 15, 20 years. And so Harris County is right on the edge of being either a Democratic or Republican county. And as people tend to migrate to the suburbs and move to the Woodlands and Montgomery County and these other places, you're going to see Harris County become more like the city of Houston, which in the city of Houston elections, just the pure city elections, they vote Democrat all the time, except for a couple of the districts that necessarily, River Oaks and places like that, the Bel Air areas, that are always going to vote Republican. Other than that, the city votes always Democratic. The county's going to start doing that eventually too.
And I mean, this goes to my point that I tried to make last week and I made before on this show. I mean, this is politics. This isn't really our area of expertise. Chris, we brought him on tonight because he is kind of an expert in that and talks about it weekly. But Julio, you and I mean, this is just kind of, it's emblematic of what happens to everybody in that we're all getting caught up in the political system. No matter what your daily role is, you're getting swept up into it. And so what I think is being lost on a lot of the voters is what effect it has on people every day down at the courthouse. And that a lot of these judges, they're politicians. They're not really making decisions necessarily in what's in the best interest. Chris, you gave me your mouth disease there at the beginning where I can't speak. But they're not necessarily working in the best interest in a lot of cases of the individual. They look at everybody as a number. And just one more number on the docket to shuffle through and pad statistics. And I think that's what's really being lost here in the whole political talk is what happens at the local level to the individuals. And that's what's a shame about this.
Chris, let me take your opinion on this as well as the panel here and Jimmy. If a Republican is a Republican judge or it's a Democrat judge, and this is dovetailing off what Jimmy said, do we see any change? Are there any, other than just being red or blue, or are there going to be any real substantive changes that we see?
I think, go ahead, Chris.
I've talked about this for years that we should not have a system of electing judges based on partisan politics. And I did a show on this with Jimmy, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago on this very show that we talked the whole show on this, where and I call it the Tritico plan, that we should just have judicial elections that are nonpartisan. If you want to run for judge, run for judge. You're not tied to a political party, and it should not be at a time when anybody else is running for office. Do it at a different time, and it's just for judges. And you just run, and you elect the best judge. And and somebody's about to say, well, then only lawyers would be voting. Great, that's fine with me because we're the ones who know. And so let's get the best judge in there. I have a lot of judges that I vote for that are Republicans. I have a lot of judges I vote for that are Democrats. I'm not going to say who they are, but I vote for them because they're the best judge.
And that goes to the point of voting for the person, not the party.
In that race.
Yeah, that's true. And my point is not to make a blanket assertion, although I guess I did in some ways, in that there are some judges who do their job, and they do look at individuals, and they read the motions that lawyers file. They read the character letters that are submitted on behalf of somebody before a sentencing hearing. And so we do have those judges, but there's also those judges out there who they're just concerned with making it to the next election and getting reelected.
Well, and that's the judge I don't want.
Yeah.
That's the judge I don't want.
Right.
I've told several clients this in just the last couple of months when they've asked about, well, why is the judge doing this to me while I'm on bond? Why is the judge doing that to me on bond? The fact of the matter is they're politicians, and their worst nightmare is winding up on the front page of the Chronicle having to explain to some reporter why they didn't do more to stop X, Y, or Z from happening. And that's not what we hired them to do. As far as, is one party better than the other? Broad strokes, I would say that as a criminal defense lawyer, I prefer left-leaning judges. That said, some of the best judges in the courthouse that I can think of run on a Republican ticket, and some of the very worst that I can think of run on a Democratic ticket. The fact is, they're politicians,
Right.
and you can't judge how they will run their courtroom or whether they will be fair based on the party that they threw in with.
So let me ask this: are there who decides the rules as to it being a you have to go into a party, or are there elections that we can see that there are judges or other seats that are available that you don't have to run on a ticket, that you don't have to declare Republican or Democrat?
City of Houston is nonpartisan.
Yeah.
You can't
Well,
declare
city.
you can't declare a party for a City of Houston race.
But in the state of Texas, when you're running for a bench above the city of Houston, you have to be in a party. And when I first started practicing law, there was no Republican judges in Harris County, and then when the Republicans swept in, they all switched to Republican, and then they were all Republicans for a long time. And then when Clinton won, we got some Democrats back, and it's been kind of swinging back and forth ever since.
Yeah, I want to move on. I mean, this has been a great discussion on politics, but again, it's out of our bell curve, and I enjoy it. I mean, I know a lot of people do, but I want to move on to another, because it is a little bit political, because this person did run for DA a few years ago, and that is the ever-recurring story of David Temple and Kelly Siegler, again making the news cycle this week with the 48 Hours episode that ran. And for those of y'all who didn't see it, you can go to 48 Hours website, you can watch the episode in its entirety, and you can see HCCLA members Casey Gautreaux and Stanley Schneider, who have taken up David Temple's case post-conviction and are trying to, and I understand we're going to get a ruling next week, guys, from the Court of Criminal Appeals. At least that's the expected timetable. We should get something hopefully Wednesday of next week, just in time to break here on the show, hopefully. But it was an interesting look into the case, and I thought the 48 Hours did an excellent job of going through in detail. And I got to hand it to Kelly, guys. She did sit there and take the questions. Now, I don't think she did a great job answering them, but it was certainly fun to watch her kind of squirm and get some heat from the 48 Hours reporter.
Well, Jordan, you want to set it up?
Well, I've got to say, sometimes Schadenfreude is a little bit fun, but one of the concerns that I have about this case, and a lot of the cases that we're seeing, where we're seeing exonerations, where we're seeing the prosecutors cheating to win, and the issue of innocence comes up. And from my perspective, while it certainly makes a more compelling story if David Temple is innocent and had nothing to do with his wife's killing, that is a side issue. The issue here is that Kelly Siegler cheated to put a citizen in prison for the rest of his life. And now, when she's called on it, she pretends as though she did nothing wrong. She turned over everything she was supposed to do. When Judge Gist, who has prisons named after him, found not only did she hide some evidence, 36 separate points where she cheated in order to win, and that's the concern. Because if she can do it to him because she thinks he's guilty, she can do it to anyone because she thinks they're guilty.
And this was essentially a cold case by the time it got tried. I mean, the murder happened in 1999. By the time it was tried, it was almost 8 years later, and he wasn't charged for 5 or 6 years after the incident.
He was indicted very shortly after the Scott Peterson case.
Yeah.
That was in talking to Ms. Gautreaux, that was kind of the connection back. It was an interesting point of timing that the Scott Peterson verdict came down, and then my understanding is within a couple or a few weeks, David Temple had been indicted for this murder that when they had previously presented it to the grand jury, got no indictment.
So I don't want to do any miscarriage of justice, but so Siegler comes in and says, David Temple, a respected man of the community, you murdered your wife and your unborn kid. She tried him, got her conviction, and then years later, after he's pronounced his innocence and hired lawyers, and his family has gone bankrupt trying to defend him. Stan Snyder and Casey Gocho pull out a stack about this big and say, you see all this stuff? We should have known about this when we were trying David Temple, and we didn't. And Siegler, you cheated. And if we had known about this, the jury might have come back with something different. So I pose to you, did they deserve to know? Should they have?
The jury?
The jury.
That there was another guy that looked suspicious enough that the police did a full-on investigation of this guy. Turned out that he had borrowed, without permission, borrowed from his father a shotgun that was strikingly similar to the one used on the victim, that he initially told investigators that he was at school all day and couldn't have been the person who'd shot him, shot Mrs. Temple, even though it turned out that he'd skipped school that afternoon and couldn't really account for his whereabouts. Yeah, clearly they should have known. Judge Billy Harmon looked at this stuff, which, if you know Judge Harmon, he is no pro-defense judge. He looked at this stuff and said, basically, oh my God, if I had known about these things, he was the trial judge at the time, if I had known that Ms. Siegler had this information, clearly I would have ordered her to turn it over to the defense, because the Supreme Court says that she has to turn this sort of thing over to the defense.
So Jordan, let me pose this question, because I know that the viewers out there are going to say, and there's people out there are going to say, I don't care, this man, he was found guilty, where there's smoke, there's fire. But is the fact that he is innocent the issue, or what is the real issue?
The real issue is that she cheated and she broke the law to try to get a jury to follow her view of what the law ought to be. I don't have any doubt in my mind that Kelly Siegler genuinely believed that David Temple killed his wife. I have no idea whether David Temple killed his wife or not, but that's not the issue here. The issue here is that she cheated, she hid evidence that suggested that perhaps another person committed this murder, and sent a man to prison for the rest of his life, knowing full well that there was another viable suspect there. That she didn't believe it, because I think what she said on 48 Hours was, he was a kid, why would he go do something like this? I'd be interested to see how many juvenile prosecutions Kelly Siegler was involved in.
But Chris, isn't it, I mean, I hear you, Jordan, but I mean, isn't his innocence also an issue here? Because, I mean, if you watch the 48 Hour special, you've got the investigator, Steve Clappert, breaking down in tears, saying that this man is innocent. I mean, it's not just a question of the Brady material, Jordan. I mean, it really is, in my opinion, also whether he's actually innocent.
But I tend to agree with Jordan that what the court is looking at right now is not is he innocent. The court is looking at, was there a breakdown in the trial process that rendered this fundamentally unfair? And if it was, do we get to do this again, or should we have to start over, or is it so fundamentally flawed now we have to let this man go? The simple fact of the matter is, and to answer the question that was asked earlier, who cares? Well, we should all care. The Constitution has to work for everyone. I don't care if he killed his wife. I don't care if he didn't kill his wife. The Constitution has to work the same for every citizen, whether we like this citizen or whether we don't like this citizen. We have to treat them all the same. And if we can't treat them all the same, we have no system at all, and it doesn't work for any of us. And so David Temple deserves the same level of due process that we give someone accused of driving while intoxicated. And we can't get upset about someone who the law enforcement officer cheated when he gave him the breathalyzer. If we get mad about that, we should get mad about Kelly Siegler saying it doesn't matter that a kid lied. It does matter, because Kelly Siegler is not the arbiter of the facts. The jury is. And Kelly had a duty to turn that over. The jury is the only 12 people who get to decide, does it matter if this kid lied? Not Kelly Siegler. That's why it's important.
And I think I think that Kelly felt that it was important enough that she decided that she needed to hide it. I think speaks volumes. If she had genuinely thought that it was a load of crap and that there was nothing to this kid being involved, why not turn it over to Dick?
She'd have turned it over.
Right. The reason that she didn't turn it over is because she knew full well that there was a compelling case that this kid might have committed this murder, and that if the jury heard about it, that they might well find David Temple not guilty. And to her mind, that was unacceptable because he was guilty. And that's where the breakdown comes in. And that's why, factually, whether he was or not is important. I mean, and it certainly makes a more compelling news story if it looks like he's innocent. But if Kelly Siegler is the one that gets to decide who has constitutional rights and who doesn't, then we're all in trouble, because the prosecutor is the last person who needs to decide whether the person they're prosecuting is going to be entitled to all of their constitutional rights or just the ones she thinks they ought to have.
What 48 Hours didn't air, which is a shame, is when Kelly was testifying about these very facts, she said that it's not Brady if I don't believe it's true. And that is just simply not the law. And that was her justification for not turning it over. I chose not to believe it, therefore I don't have to turn it over. Well, that means that if that is the law, there is no such thing as exculpatory evidence. And that's why I think Judge Gist overturned this, made the ruling he made.
And Chris, as always, we appreciate your thoughts. We've hit 8:30 now. I know we need to let you go and get on to other things, so we appreciate you coming on. But we thank you for joining us and hope you'll join us again. Appreciate it.
Have a good night.
You too. It is 8:30, a little past 8:30. I want to remind people that we are opening up our phone line. 713-807-1794 is the number. We also have Twitter up at HCCLA_TV, of course. You can reach us there. But I want to play a clip, guys, continuing on the Kelly Siegler discussion of our friend Rob Fickman, who was on this show last year, and what he said about her.
Not ready.
Clip's not ready.
Let me ask you this. Do you think David Temple can get a fair trial in Harris County? Or has the media and everybody in here blown this up and it's so publicized that getting a fair trial here is just not possible? And if so, what's the remedy? I mean, what do you do?
You know, I think whether he can get a fair trial has a lot to do with how much evidence has been lost due to the fact that nobody but Kelly Siegler knew to go chase it down. I mean, that's a huge issue. A handful of witnesses were heard from during this hearing, during hearings leading up to this formal hearing that Judge Gist presided over. But by the time that rolled around, you're talking about people in their late 20s or early 30s talking about events that happened when they were teenagers. And I don't know, the biggest problem with cheating like this is that now, at this point, I think it's completely impossible to ever actually fully determine who committed this murder.
You know, I think one of the more compelling things as this has unfolded was some of the investigators in their own department are the ones that came forward and said, you know what? Yes, I'm a DA investigator. Yes, I'm a cop. But this thing stinks. Something's wrong, and I just don't buy it. And to me, I mean, that doesn't happen in my DWI cases. That doesn't happen in my run-of-the-mill cases. But for an investigator to come forth time after the event took place and say, I have something on my conscience, I need to get it out, I think it's just so compelling in this issue, for this issue.
Our clip is ready. I want to play. This was Rob Fickman last year on our show and his thoughts on Kelly Siegler.
Prosecutors don't need to cheat. The average juror comes down there with a pro-prosecution bent anyway. After watching years of Law and Order on TV and watching the local news, which is very pro-cop, the average juror is indoctrinated by the time they get down there to be pro-prosecution. They don't need a prosecutor to cheat to win because they're leaning in their favor. What's really disturbing about Kelly Siegler's matter, the Temple case and now the Guidry case, is what Damon's talking about and what you're referring to, is that we're seeing a pattern here. These lawyers from Seattle that are handling the Guidry case had no knowledge, apparently, of the Temple case. And yet, through their own investigation, they've uncovered what they believe are instances of Kelly Siegler cheating to win. That is either withholding exculpatory evidence. And for our audience, that's evidence that would tend to show the person's not guilty. And the prosecutor has a duty to provide that to the defense, which in the judge found in the Temple case she did not do. And it's alleged in the Guidry case she didn't do. So, I mean, if there's this is what I believe. People repeat behaviors that lead to success for them. Kelly Siegler was known to be a big star in the DA's office. She won supposedly 50, 60 murder cases. And if she found something that worked and she kept doing that. I don't know if she cheated on one case or two cases. If she cheated on one case to send somebody to prison, that in itself is outrageous. But the fact that there may be another case and there may be other cases, I agree with you. I would say every single case that she prosecuted probably should be looked at. But it goes to something deeper, and that is the culture of the district attorney's office, which for many years, especially during the Rosenthal years, was a win at any cost culture where people were encouraged to, I think, cross lines. Kelly herself has spoken about push it all the way to if you weren't pushing it to the edge there, you weren't doing a good job. If you didn't do something that offended the judge. She's made those statements. It's outrageous. And what has happened?
Nothing.
What has happened? No, something has happened. Yeah. She's got a friggin' TV show out of this. And do you think that Dick Wolf, that
was the clip. I mean, the same stuff is still true today. It's still true to this very day, and what Rob said is exactly right. She got this TV show out of it. She pushed the envelope, and one of the things that she did say when she was pressed by the 48 Hours reporter was, when asked, well, who makes the decision of what's exculpatory? She said, I do. And to me, when she said that, I think that was probably an eye-opening experience for a lot of people who are not within the criminal justice system, who are not in it every day. Because what other world does the person, who actually holds the cards, so to speak, get to decide what's relevant to everybody? I mean, other than gambling at blackjack, where you've got a dealer. I mean, that's
right. And the dealer's not. Yeah,
and it's random. This
right. Well, I always win at blackjack, so.
Which is why you're sitting across the table.
Right. But I mean, even with blackjack, there are very specific rules when the dealer may and may not hit, when they have to stand on a set that everyone at the table realizes you're not likely to win that. But without those rules, they would just be stealing your money. And the problem is that no one is, and on top of that, there's a camera constantly watching every card the blackjack plays, every move he makes with his hands, because not even the house trusts the dealer to play by the rules. And in the criminal justice system, the house makes the rules, enforces the rules, and decides how the rules will be applied in this case.
Yeah, there's no check or balance. There's nothing, because essentially if you don't know about it, how are you supposed to be able to ask a judge to give you relief on it?
Right, and that's a problem that's particular to what we call Brady evidence, evidence that would either show that the defendant isn't guilty, or that maybe he's guilty but the punishment he should receive isn't as bad as what we would just think first blanch hearing the case. The biggest problem is, and why these make such shocking cases, is the prosecutor who's charged with handing this stuff over to the defendant, stuff that could well sink their case. If they do a good job of hiding it, nobody ever knows. Nobody ever knows. And the real problem is that even if they are found out, the likelihood of them being punished in a meaningful way is zero. If I were caught sequestering witnesses or evidence relevant to a case, I would be indicted so fast my head would spin. But nothing, I expect absolutely nothing to happen to Kelly Siegler.
Well, and the show and Kelly Siegler were sued up in Ohio for one of these cold cases, which eventually ended up in an acquittal for the individual. In other words, the guy was found not guilty, and they were actually sued in federal court, and they settled this case. So it's not everything that she touches is gold. They make mistakes, and they've gone after people who end up getting acquitted. And so the question is, does she reach sometimes? How many times has she been reached? And how many individuals have been affected by this?
Right. I don't think anybody can genuinely ever say that they've never had a suspicion that turned out to be wrong.
Well, and to go back to your point, Jordan, about his ability to get a fair trial, should he get another trial? What Rob said in that clip was that jurors are essentially conditioned to come down and be pro-prosecution from TV shows and everything else. And I've said before that I think when you have a high-profile case, your presumption of innocence it goes out the door. Right. The amount of attention a case gets, especially if you're a celebrity, a lot of people just presume that because you're charged, you must have done something wrong. Right. And I think that for him, if he were to get a new trial, first on the first trial, I think he was just a victim of circumstance. I mean, had Kelly Siegler not taken up his case and been the prosecutor on his case, I'm not sure.
He was no-billed the first time around.
Right. I'm not sure it would have gotten.
Really?
Yeah, he was no-billed. That's one of the things that was so.
Right, but setting that aside, if another prosecutor had come in, not a Kelly Siegler type of prosecutor, but if somebody else, let's say, would have come in, somebody not nearly as high profile as she was, I'm not sure that this case would have gotten the attention it did. That's my opinion. And so I think by her taking the case, it almost made it a situation where he was, it got so much attention that it was very difficult. When you throw in the pro-prosecution bias that a lot of jurors already have coming in, I think it made it difficult for him. I really do. And then you add in the fact that they're hiding 1,400 pages worth of police offense reports. As Rob said, they don't need to cheat.
Right.
They don't need to cheat. They've got, pretty much a lot of times the facts on their side. And almost in every instance, the majority of the jury panel is on their side.
And so, speaking of the office, that they don't need to cheat. The cards are already stacked against an individual who's accused. But what we're seeing now is when the government has some sort of Brady material against a specific officer. So let's say you're charged with DWI or some type of offense, and that officer happens to be under investigation for X, Y, or Z. What we're seeing now, and Jordan, you might be able to talk about this in your experience or if you've seen it, is the district attorneys now are issuing protective orders.
Right.
So that way, that particular defense lawyer who receives information about a certain law enforcement officer cannot disseminate or talk about that information to the rest of the defense community. So let's say I have a client who has an officer who's accused of some sort of misconduct or wrongdoing. I cannot tell my colleague who also has the same officer involved in that same wrongdoing that this particular officer is an issue.
Right.
Have you seen that?
I haven't had it happen to me. I've spoken to several lawyers that it has happened with.
What's your opinion on that?
I don't understand how they justify it. I don't understand a justification that actually works. The excuses that I've heard are all weak. I mean, what needs to happen is some defense lawyer needs to stand up for himself and challenge it. If nothing else, challenge it on First Amendment grounds. I cannot see how a court can properly enter an order prohibiting a citizen from talking about a matter having to do with a public official.
Well, and on an ex parte basis, too. I mean, you're not even giving... look, most protective orders or temporary restraining orders, even if a judge grants an ex parte one, it's temporary until you get a chance for a full hearing.
Right.
And what I understand is going on here, you're not getting a hearing. Basically, the order is signed, and it's a final protective order.
Right. You're handed both at the same time. Here's our Brady disclosure, as well as the protective order prohibiting you from talking about the fact that our cop is dirty.
Yeah.
And so then we're just relying on the prosecution office in another case where it involves the same officer disclosing that particular information, which, have we seen, is horrible. It doesn't work.
It doesn't happen. And then there's also, what about cases that were recently resolved that now that the case is closed, the prosecution's no longer under a duty, but if you look at the timing of things, probably did have a duty before that case got closed out to make this disclosure. Now I'm not allowed to get on the listserv and say, hey, by the way, anybody who's just closed out a case with Officer X, Y, or Z needs to go back and look at their file because he's about to blow up. He's dirty.
And what we've seen, and it goes back to, and maybe Kelly has to be the one that falls, and maybe she has to be made, taken under review, because there is a grievance that has been filed against her, okay? And we'll be awaiting to see whether or not that they're going to strip her from her license, whether or not they're going to strip her from practicing law.
Well, the irony of ironies is that the only serious discipline meted out against a prosecutor for cheating in recent memory was a lawyer who was grieved by Kelly Siegler. It was, I think, Sebesta. So, I mean, irony of ironies. Now, I mean, a fat lot of good it did. They disbarred a man who had retired, but it's the only thing I can think of.
She's not practicing.
Right. I mean, it's the only time I can think of when they've been actually willing to discipline a prosecutor for cheating was a guy who had already resigned from being a prosecutor and it was based on the grievance from Kelly Siegler.
I mean, I
who-
guess technically she is practicing
she's licensed.
on this cold justice. I guess she's
Right.
she's technically practicing, but man, I want to go back to the juror thing for a second because I read an interesting article, and going back on Rob's thoughts about the jurors being conditioned. I read this interesting article on the MarshallProject.org, and it made me think what happens when after a trial's over and the jurors have regrets about their decisions. And it was an interesting insight. This juror was part of a jury that sentenced a man to death, put him on death row. And years later, he's looking back and saying, if only I had been strong enough to hold out and be the one to not let it go to the death penalty. And I wonder how much of that, because I've never gotten to serve on a jury, but I wonder how much of that happens to people after they have served on a jury. For instance, in the Temple case, I mean, what do these jurors think now? If my God, what if I had heard that evidence? What if I had heard all that evidence that was excluded, that Kelly Siegler didn't think we needed to know about?
I would be very, very angry.
Well, I think if 48 Hours wants to do another story, that's where I think the interesting story would be, is to go back and find the 12 jurors who sat on David Temple's case and find out what they think now that all this is coming out. Because I tell you what, after I read this article, it made me think, like, how often does it happen that a juror, as they get, because some people, they sit on a jury when they're in their early or mid-20s or even late 20s, and then 10 years go by and we all know we change, our opinions change, our views change on things. What does the 45-year-old you think about what you did when you were sitting in a jury room at 26? And I think that, like Rob said, with everybody coming in on a pro-prosecution bent, that you're very impressionable as you're growing up. Even in your early to mid-20s, I mean, even though you're an adult and you're independent, you're not necessarily doing things maybe for the most part to try and impress people, but I do feel like you do things and you make decisions based upon what your peer group is doing. And when you're in that range, essentially those jurors become your peer group. And if you're not a strong enough personality, maybe you don't want to step out. Maybe you don't want to be that lone voice. You're not ready at that age to do that. So I'd be interested to hear those stories.
I would too. I ask at this point, I ask every jury during voir dire, I give them the situation of, imagine it's 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, you're the lone holdout. You've got either 5 or 11, depending on whether you're talking about a misdemeanor or a felony. You've got 5 or 11 people looking at you, watching their watch, and then looking back at you like, come on. I'll ask them, how many of you think you might cave to that kind of pressure? And you'll get a few people that'll raise their hand. And generally speaking, those people are gone. It does take a certain amount of fortitude to stand up to other people that you've spent the last several days building relationships with and say, we disagree. Not only do we disagree, but I have to stand on my principle and continue to disagree. It takes a strong person to do that, and not everybody can do it.
There's a good blog out there by Joanne Music, who talks about a Dallas DA who was just recently disciplined for non-disclosure of potentially exculpatory evidence. And as a juror, I would have to say, that'd make me feel a little bit better that a prosecutor who hid some evidence got disciplined. But at the end of the day, that juror will have to live with sitting in judgment upon somebody and affecting that individual for the rest of his life or their lives. Is that enough, Jordan? Is that enough? Do you think it's enough for a juror to know, okay, well, at least that prosecutor got some discipline, or should there be more?
It's hard to say. I think part of the problem that we see in a lot of cases is that jurors aren't doing the whole job. They're not insisting that the state prove beyond a reasonable doubt. They're just insisting that the state prove probably. If the whole idea of requiring 6 or 12 people to agree that the case has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt is the evidence here is so compelling, it's outside the zone of reasonable discussion. Everyone agrees that we've got the right guy. And I think part of this is what Rob talked about, that jurors come in so conditioned that the police are the good guys, the prosecutors are the good guys, and that we're shady and not to be trusted. And I've gotten the feeling that unless we have an explicit discussion with jurors about, I can't prove his innocence, I'm not in a position that I can do that, and so I'm not going to try, I've found that I have better success when we have that explicit discussion. But when I leave it unsaid, jurors look to us to prove that our clients aren't guilty, because why would the cops say otherwise if it wasn't so?
I think Dick DeGuerin said it best, and it was in the article and in the video, that he doesn't have to, we're not here to prove that David Temple did not murder his wife. We just want to have enough evidence, or to at least show you that there's enough evidence out there that it's not proven beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right.
And when the government cheats to get there and to get their verdict, that's a big problem.
Yeah, they're only getting half the story.
Let me ask you this from a broader kind of philosophical standpoint. Let's say you're a prosecutor in this case, and 10 years later some conviction comes back, like the David Temple case, and you're required to defend the government's actions. What's your ethical duty there? I mean, are you supposed to say, you know what, or are you supposed to just follow your marching orders?
Well, I mean, obviously we're regularly asked to represent people that we know for a fact are guilty, and that because they did the thing they're accused of, they're probably terrible people. It doesn't take much thought, though. We have a very clear job. And I can recognize that this makes a prosecutor's job murkier, but their job is not simply to advocate for the state of Texas. Their job is to do justice, because the state of Texas has no interest in doing anything but justice to its citizens. And so if a prosecutor gets a case that they have real problems with, the law is pretty clear. They're supposed to do what they think is just, not try to protect a conviction that they recognize is faulty. They're not supposed to prosecute a person where they recognize that there's significant problems with this case. They're supposed to see that justice is done. If the person's guilty, push for a conviction. If you have to cheat to get there, you have to let this one go and move on to the next. And so ethically, if a prosecutor has a problem with a case that they've been handed by their superiors, I mean, I was following orders is not a defense and hasn't been for a very long time. You have an ethical obligation to do justice. If you can't do that in the office that you're in, you have an ethical obligation to go find a new job.
You know, we've seen that. You know, we've seen it in movies and in stories, and I was following, and you said it best, I was following orders is just not a defense, and it hasn't been for a long time.
Right.
You know.
Well, I think the state bar disciplinary rules have made it pretty clear that prosecutors fall under a different standard in terms of what their ethical obligations are when representing the state. I mean, they're not, as you said, Jordan, they're not representing a client. And so it's a different standard. They are there to seek justice, not to advocate solely on behalf of the state of Texas. I mean, their job is a lot broader than just advocating for their client. And so, you know, it's an interesting case. We only got a few minutes left, and I want to get to one thing here before we run out of time, because Pat McCann did write a great article for us this week, and it was about imprisoning alcoholics.
Yep.
And I would be remiss if we didn't at least spend the last few minutes we have on this show talking about this, because his point is that we have DWI courts in lower level courts here in Harris County. We don't have them at a felony level. And even more, what we call the hardcore counties, Montgomery County and some of the others, they have felony level DWI courts, and Harris County is without one. It's time that we get one here, isn't it?
I agree.
It is a situation where we have so many people, and I think what is missing here, and a lot of people think, well, what about the guy who gets 15 DWIs? To Pat's article, it is the guy who is getting a true third offense, who perhaps there's still a chance to save him, and that why are we just going to ship him off to prison when there may still be an opportunity there?
Yeah, I mean, so I do a lot of DWI work. I've never met a person charged with a third offense DWI that I didn't have, at the very least, serious concerns that that person had a serious drinking problem. In order to be charged with a felony DWI because of repeat offenses, you have to not just have 2 prior incidents of DWI in your past. You have to have at least 2 prior convictions that happened in such a way that You got your first DWI charge and were then convicted. Then you got your second DWI charge and were convicted. And now you're charged with your third offense DWI. Most people who are able to control their drinking get the picture after the first or second. Like I said, I don't think I've ever dealt with a third offender who, at the very least, had trouble controlling himself when he was drinking. But the simple fact is that if you engage in some effective intervention on the third one, you're a lot less likely to see a fourth, fifth, sixth, and the guy who goes to prison for life on a 9th or 10th DWI, or God forbid, drives through a family of 5 in a minivan.
And we have a drug court. I mean, drugs and alcohol is just as addicting, if not more addicting than drugs for some people.
It's the same issue, but the real problem is that you don't have as many drug addicts killing people on the highway as you do DWIs. I mean, the fact of the matter is that I think that the disconnect comes in because you're not being punished for possessing the thing you're addicted to. You're being punished for the behavior the dangerous behavior that you engaged in after you used. And so I think that's where some people at least see a disconnect between drug cases and repeat DWIs.
Well, and this is why I always tell my clients on the DWI seconds, you have to fight. Because if you're living in Harris County, if you have 2, because of your pattern, that third is coming. Hope to God it doesn't, but you better you're on that group of people that might get your third. And in Harris County, if you get your third, you're looking at 2 to 10 years in prison. And there ain't no way around it. You are going to be in a fight for your life. And we see it. You know, individuals, they get arrested, they get their first DWI at 19, 20, 21. They get their second one at 30, they get their third one or charged their third one at 40. They have families. They're good, hardworking people. They just have an alcohol problem, and suddenly they're looking at going to prison, and and their whole life is screwed.
Or just being a convicted felon.
There is, or just being a convicted felon.
For drinking.
There is one thing, as we're wrapping up shortly, I want to say is that next Wednesday, for all the lawyers watching, we have at Beer Paretti's, we have a CLE on defending DWI blood cases, where if you're taking these cases, you need to check it out. HCCLATV.org will have it, and the HCCLA website will have it. You need to check it out if you're planning on defending blood cases. We have one of the best on the planet that's going to be speaking.
And on that note, we're going to wrap it up this evening, ladies and gentlemen. We appreciate you joining us as always. Jordan Lewis, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having
me. Chris Tritico, thanks for joining us via Skype. We appreciate it as always. And for those of you who want to follow us on social media, come check us out on Facebook, check us out on Twitter. We'll see you next week. Good night, everybody.
Good night.